Hello, everyone. My name is Kate Kratzen, and I'm the curator at the David Winton Bell Gallery at Brown University and currently acting director. Before I introduce Jules Gimbrone and Marie Thompson, I'd like to thank my colleagues from the Brown Arts Initiative, Sean Tavares and Gregory Picard, who will be running the Zoom tech today. Jules Gimbrone and I have been working on an exhibition for the Brown Arts Initiative's Cohen Gallery, which of course has been rescheduled several times because of the pandemic. We're hoping to mount the show this fall, and our many conversations about Jules's project have often included discussions around data and quantification and how those terms migrate across academic fields. Love Data Week is, quote, an international celebration of data aiming to raise awareness and build a community to engage on topics related to research data management, sharing, preservation, reuse, and library-based research data services. And the theme of Brown's virtual Love Data Week 2021 is Data Delivering a Better Future. Though this conversation, titled Noise, Gender, Data, occurs at the margins of Love Data Week and its more traditional approaches to data, I believe that these fringe spaces are where artistic discourse exists in its fullest capacity, redrawing borders and reimagining or destabilizing our collective understanding of terms that are otherwise reified. When Love Data Week appeared on our horizon at BAI, I thought that Jules and one of the influential thinkers they are engaged with would be an ideal intervention. Jules is a visual and sonic artist based in New York. Their work has appeared internationally in a variety of venues, including the Walker Art Center, Minneapolis, Sculpture Center, MoMA PS1, the Rubin Museum of Art, Socrates Sculpture Park, and Judson Church, New York, and Los Angeles Contemporary Exhibitions, Human Resources LA, and LAXART Los Angeles. Jules is also the author of the Walker Art Center artist op-ed, Touching a Third Sound, Transcensing in a World of Deepfakes, which I'm sure we will discuss today. When I asked Jules who they would like to be in conversation for Love Data Week, they immediately responded Marie Thompson. Marie is a researcher living in Nottingham, UK. She is a lecturer in music at the Open University and the author of Beyond Unwanted Sound, Noise, Affect, and Aesthetic Moralism, which was published by Bloomsbury in 2017. And she is the principal investigator of the Arts and Humanities Research Council project, Tinnitus, Auditory Knowledge and the Arts. Additional articles include Your Womb, The Perfect Classroom, Prenatal Sound Systems and Uterine Autophilia, published in Feminist Review, Sonic Feminisms, Doing Gender in Neoliberal Times, included in the Bloomsbury Handbook of Sonic Methodologies, and Whiteness and the Ontological Turn in Sound Studies. Now, Jules, I want to ask you first, because you wanted to speak to Marie, why have you found her work so influential on yours? And I do want to quote one of Marie's many insights from the pre-conversation we had last week, where she said, you can't talk about data without the means of mediation, because I think that is really going to be the core of our conversation today.
Yeah, well, thank you, Kate and Marie and everyone at Brown for facilitating this. Yeah, I mean, as someone who works in this field of sound and visual art and kind of interdisciplinary studies, and also teaches, I teach a history of sound art class. I taught in different schools, sound theory kind of courses. It's just Marie's writing has been so important in order to take the conversation around the potential of sound to kind of point to larger social, political power systems and structures in our world. And she does it in such a succinct and clear way. And she also doesn't like. There's this tendency in some realms of sound studies to like fetishize sound, right? To make it this exceptional thing that we're this phenomenon that we're like all just like in awe of. And she really breaks that down, and she does show how sound is this really interesting interactive space and can create all these different nodules for engagement, but does it in a way that is constantly like grounding it in the present realities and the kind of power systems and structures. And I always just find that so important, because we can get lost in sound. Like that's something that some people like to do, right? We can get like this haze of zone, like kind of, just closing your eyes and, and getting lost. And I like that. I love that potential of sound and music and, the auditory. But what happens when we start to ground it in and how those sounds are produced and who's listening and who's creating and these interactions, and then we can have these kind of experiences that are maybe transcendent, but then also grounded in the real world and into the lives of people, into systems and structures and power dynamics. And that's something that is just my favorite thing to talk about and think about. And so Marie's work just really, I don't know, it just supports that kind of analysis. That's the broader, that's the picture.
No, maybe now is the time to talk about the project you've been working on at Cohen and kind of describe how sound and visual and material objects work in your practice, and how that relates to, I think, a lot of what Marie and you had to say in our pre-conversation around, visuality and visibility versus audibility and invisibility, and the tension between those modes of sensing.
Yeah, so my background is in performance, and I worked a lot with choreographers. And so when I develop a new piece, especially like a solo show that's like an installation, I think about it almost through choreography and composition and interactivity. So, the specifics of the show aren't totally worked out yet, but the ideas around, the idea is to set up like a staging and that really, I kind of bouncing around this idea of this queer sandbox or something that is trying to be entrained by these pulsing systems or quantitative units outside of this sandbox. And then the sandbox is creating forms and structures that is responding to and breaking down this larger, almost like a metronome of pulse that is trying to create a weather system or an entrainment of the subjects inside of this system. And so it's not, I have a lot of research and writing that I'm doing around it. It's not totally clarified yet, but we will get there in the fall. But yeah, I'm really interested in certain queer trans strategies that relate to this idea of the sonic in becoming legible or illegible in certain systems, and kind of coming in and out of perception through different sensory systems as well. And that being a strategy that I'm trying to employ in developing these sculptural sound performative systems. And yeah, so in terms of data, I think this idea or this question around Marie's talking about looking at the apparatus through which data appears. I mean, I think that it'd be great, Marie, if you can talk about that more too, because I think that's just the most kind of important piece of this, is looking at the apparatus.
Yeah, should I jump in now and maybe say some of that? Yeah, so I guess I'd want to start as well by expressing how delighted I am to be able to have this conversation with Jules, and your organizational efforts as well around this, Kate. I was really honored and thrilled to be invited to have this conversation, and also to have some time to engage with Jules's work. And I feel that engaging with Jules's work has enabled me to rethink or think through and with and about some of the approaches that I've taken to sound in different ways, and I'm really grateful for that opportunity. And I think one of the things that Jules's work for me has drawn attention to, or helped amplify, I guess, is this notion that we can't talk about data as an unmediated and unshaped phenomenon. So when I was preparing for this event, I sort of was panicking a bit because I don't really talk about data. I talk a lot about information in the information theory sense, and I talk about signals, but the term data is not something that I've engaged with as much in my work. And while I was maybe admitting this is bad, while I was frantically Googling, you know, what's the relationship between information and data, Google helpfully provided me with this distinction where it said information is sorted and contextualized data. Data is raw fact that is not even decontextualized, but hasn't been provided. There's no background context to it. So this is, you know, this is terrible practice in terms of research, but this is what Google was telling me was the relationship between information and data. Now, I don't use information in quite that way for lots of complicated reasons that we probably shouldn't go into here. Information, in my understanding, is coming from information theory, which probably means something more akin to what data is being referred to here. But I thought this reference to data as fact or the most basic unit of knowledge was really striking, partly because of its relationship to how sound is sometimes talked about as well. So sometimes with sound, despite sound being very obviously mediated, and there's lots of things that draw attention to sound's mediation, sound is often articulated as some kind of unmediated or immediate experience, or some kind of level of truth that somehow bypasses structures of mediation. And when I say structures of mediation, I mean technical apparatus in part. So with sound, one of the most obvious means of mediation is the airwaves through which sound travels. But I also mean the social and ideological structures that shape how sound is interpreted, perceived, heard, felt, organized, silenced, and so on. And I think there's an interesting parallel in terms of thinking about data. I think sometimes data is attached to fantasies of raw information or raw knowledge that is somehow truthful in its immediateness. I'm not sure immediateness is a word, but we'll go with it for the moment. And I think what Jules and I are both interested in is paying attention to that relationship between abstractions, and whether they be data abstractions or sonic abstractions, and the means through which those abstractions come to be. Jules, do you think that's a fair assessment of things?
You can talk about, I think, gender in that way as well. I mean, it feels very, I think that when we make those connections, if we put them into that like Venn diagram or these systems of thinking, gender falls right into sound and data in that same capacity, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you want to say a bit more on that?
I mean, I just like hearing you talk, so I would just like you to talk a bit more. And yeah, so no, I would like you to keep talking.
I mean, I remember, and again, my notes are so full of text taken directly from Marie and Jules's writing, but also from conversations I've had with them. So I should have citations in my notes, and I don't. But one of my favorite moments of our preparatory conversation, I think, was when Marie said that the conditions of data mediation are what produce the noise. And so I'm interested in how the term noise infiltrates both of your thinking around data and mediation, because it's very important. Certainly, Marie wrote an entire book about it. But Jules, Jules, Marie's book has been influential on your work and your thinking about the sound and visuality that you're producing in your practice.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's like once we can identify noise as and what what are the perceptual and cognitive and social and political structures that point to what is considered noise, and we can look at it in so many different capacities, both like on the the most granular perceptive orientation towards in like in the brain versus like what's noise in terms of a political system. So we can look at the macro and the micro. I mean, once we identify the noise, which is so interesting, it's like then we can identify the systems that either validate or invalidate what is considered noise, and or this idea of purity of data, or these like kind of truth molecules or something that we're talking about. I mean, like it's just like endlessly interesting in terms of being able to point to so clearly what is actually what is happening to validate or invalidate certain phenomenon or things that are happening.
I'm sure that Marie caught this, but I'm really interested in the idea of purity of data and purity of silence that you talk about in some of your articles, and particularly the whiteness and the ontological turn in sound studies, if I recall.
Yeah, so there's a couple of ways I would maybe think about that idea of the purity of sound in relation to noise as well. So one is related to how I talk about noise in the book that you've been referring to, in relation to this idea that noise is something that dirties the system. And in my reading, noise is something that is necessary to the transmission of information, to mediation, to these abstractions that we are referring to, because the means of mediation always transform the signal in one way or another. And whether or not we recognize that transformation and whether or not we can abstract it and call it noise is kind of secondary. So there's this, but that also connects to some writing from acoustic ecology and environmental sound art that understands noise definitively as a kind of polluting or negatively disrupting force. And to cut a long story short, my argument is it's a bit more complicated than that. And we do need to attend to these complex relations. While it might be politically useful to be able to say noise pollution can be harmful, here is all this data that shows that noise pollution is harmful, and I wouldn't ever really detract from that. And one of the things that we might talk about later is that while we talk about these abstractions and as problematic in lots of ways, they can also be strategically useful in certain contexts as well. So this is a good example of the ways in which sound can be rendered data, can be rendered abstraction, but is also needing to attend to the conditions of mediation. So there's lots of writing about the effects of noise pollution as something damaging and harmful. And one of the issues here is what noise pollution refers to is actually very vague. And separating noise pollution out from the complexities of lived environments, for example, is very difficult because noise pollution is often accompanied by other forms of pollution as well. Now, that's not to say that there might be situations in which it's useful to invoke this idea of noise pollution, but the ways that data is gathered around noise pollution often rely on quite a problematic definition of noise, insofar as noise becomes conflated either with high volume sound or sound from particular sources, and how that is defined can vary across contexts, or not even really be attended to in writing about noise pollution. So that's a very tangential issue, I guess, but it's kind of tangential to some of what we're talking about here, but at the same time it shows the ways in which abstractions, you know, even an abstraction about noise is subject to this stripping away of context that renders it a pure construction that is in of itself complicated in its relationship to the lived experience. I guess the other thing around purity, and this goes back to something that we were gesturing towards earlier, is this idea that sound is somehow pure experience or unmediated experience, and again this desire to transcend the categories, the conditions of mediation through which that's experienced. And so I guess there's two sides to this. One is that often the concepts and constructs that we use to talk about sound require abstractions that are quite limited and require us to kind of make choices about what we include and don't include. And I think this is something that Jules's work really makes clear. And on the other side, we have this notion that sound somehow transcends those processes. And that can also be problematic in that it disavows or discounts how deep those processes of mediation go. I don't know if that makes any sense.
Yeah, and I would also just say, just to give a couple of examples, you know, just one is the whole mechanism of the recording studio. I mean, something that I thought about in my work in different times about, you know, you go into a recording studio as it functions in terms of creating music or creating any kind of audio content, you know, is to go in and have the most, you know, pure recorded experience as possible, so that you eliminate every other noise or leakage into the space. Like you're trying to seal the space, like a you know, and eliminate any interference completely. And that is the goal of the good, you know, the sound studio, is to eliminate all, you know, even to the point of, yes, you might go into a resonant space, but that is like very specific. And usually you add any kind of reflective sound afterwards. You're going into the most dampening space possible to record. And the idea is you're trying to capture the purity of that voice, of that instrument. And then, you know, take that pure form and maybe add it to something else, and then render something that is, you know, this exact replica of the actual thing, right? So there's like the mechanisms of recording speak to this as well. And we can also talk in terms of, like you're talking acoustic ecology, we can also talk about in terms of field recording as well, like that in a way that we can make, maybe, I'm not going to go, we don't have to go there, but maybe we can make a relationship to photography, and that you are kind of, you know, recording some essential truth, you know, through these mechanisms of recording audio and producing audio. And I think that that's part of this idea of neutrality, or like we can talk about it in terms of whiteness and white aurality, and yeah, so there's like all these kind of assumptions around the ability to even approximate and approach this idea of truth or purity in like the roots of these technologies, I guess.
Yeah, and I guess one of the reasons that I feel this conversation is moving in so many different directions is because what we have is these different layers around sound. And to bring it back to data again, and data as well, we have the technical, we have the ideological, we have the environmental, we have all we have the linguistic, we have all these different levels and layers that are sometimes mirroring, sometimes intersecting or imbricated with one another. And I certainly find this in my work. I find myself slipping between these different layers. So I'm talking about the technical and the ideological at the same time. And because those two things inform one another as well, of course. But it makes, and this is a problem with noise in general. Noise has so many different definitions and resonances that you end up necessarily moving between these different fields. And I think some of what your work addresses, Jules, around the idea of membranes and borders that can be passed through, for me, really invokes some of these challenges about talking about noise in this context, because there is these things feel separate and appear separate, but also they're leaking and they're flowing in between one another, but not in a way that suggests everything is just an undetermined mass, I guess.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm thinking of the word slippages, and then you said leaking, like the slippages that I find in particularly Jules talking about their work, because as you were talking about, you know, the illusion, say, of the recording studio as a pure space. Of course, I'm thinking about your current illusion project, Jules, and I thought maybe you could elaborate on that, because that includes conversations around data quantification, I believe, in some of the interviews you're doing with participants.
Yeah, so I had this opportunity to work with Helena Anrather and her gallery to think about like a residency that would serve me. She was very generous, and I was thinking about doing it. I was thinking about how to create space and do some research around this idea of illusion, which has always been in my work. You know, illusion between perceptive systems like the sonic and the visual, and trying to elicit a kind of confusion or a jumbling of these systems to create a third thing, maybe. You know, that's something that's very present in my work. Or thinking about a trans subjectivity as playing with and working with like a self-perceptual illusion system that like builds yourself into reality, and like therefore like kind of changes that around you. And, you know, so there's like all of these ways in which I toy and play with, I think, illusion in my work. I just hadn't pointed to it more specifically. And so I wanted to do some research around it, but specifically I wanted to talk to people who were in fields that may not think about illusions. I can't interview a magician or maybe another artist because, but other people who are working more in systems that are like more quantifiable, or maybe there's less conversation around it. So I got to interview a bunch of different people, and it's just been really interesting because, you know, I interviewed epidemiologists, principals of public schools, surgeons. I interviewed someone who has face blindness, which is a really interesting, you know, perceptual issue, but also like this power where, you know, they're not able to recognize faces, and like, what does that mean in terms of, you know, are we living in the illusion that we can, you know, or, you know, who's living in whose illusion? And then thinking about, and also talking to people who work with people with autism or other mental health disorders. I had 2 amazing conversations with surgeons, and yeah, so, and one of the parts in that conversation that have really like sparked my interest or question is so when I do talk to all these people, what ends up happening, especially people who are working in fields like epidemiology or principals of public schools, or people who are working to help people, right? To help change systems that are unequal and imbalanced and racist and classist, and there's discrimination around gender, and we're trying to like work through these large power systems and structures to change, is that they have to hold two things at once constantly. I also talked to meditation instructor and Buddhist teacher, and we also can go into this in terms of like a spiritual realm, but you have to hold two things at once. Basically, they're holding that, these quantifiable systems in which, like, for example, students appear through quantifying their communities and access to resources and like the whole mechanisms of quantifying people, right? So students then appear through these systems of quantification. And so they have to work in that realm, but simultaneously they understand that those systems of quantification also hurt the people that they're trying to help. And so how do you balance that? And how do you hold both things to be true at once? And one of the most beautiful, metaphors, or not even metaphors, a very tangible thing. The surgeon is telling me, one of the things, I was like, okay, so when does the person that you're talking to become the body? And she says, okay, when we drape the surgical sheet over the body, and you have to like kind of, just have the one part of the body that you're performing on. So that's like a really interesting metaphor. But then also she was talking about when you go to school and you study anatomy, they give you like, there's a couple, different kinds of anatomy, I guess, you learn in terms of being able to do surgery. And then you realize once you start doing surgeries, so they're saying all these bodies are the same, and we have this, and this, and this. And so the body is quantifiable. The body is this system of knowing that we have, studied in Western medicine. We understand these systems. And then you understand also that when you start doing the work, that every body is a little different, actually, and the placement of the organs and the little ways. And so when you're a surgeon, just like when you're a principal or when you're an epidemiologist, you have to like toggle between everybody's the same and everybody's different simultaneously at the same time. That's how you're a good surgeon. And and really in real time, being able to work through those different kinds of knowledge. And so that's something that I've taken away from these conversations that I think is pretty interesting to me, and I think will serve to develop work that continues to both point to, okay, this is a gendered system or body, or like we can talk about it, but then at the same time we're abstracting and confusing, and we're making something that seems solid not solid, and we're putting sound through it that makes it into a different thing that is then turning that into another energy transfer system, so we're like able to hold those two things at the same time. That's a long story short of, or that's just a long story.
That's so, sorry, Kate.
Please go ahead.
That's so interesting in terms of highlighting the complexity of perception, right? Like the idea that the people you are talking to are able to articulate that they are going through these different perceptual modes, where I'm really struck by the example of the surgeon, where they're having to move for a whole host of reasons between these different perceptions and hold them either apart. I'm guessing that there are moments where it is necessary to cleave those two things from one another, and at the same time, they absolutely recognize that there are these two modes going on at once. That's so interesting. Yeah. And the implications of that are really quite striking in terms of thinking about perception and the importance of perception to information, to our understandings of bodies, gender, other social experiences. And yeah, some of what you've said as well about head teachers and the complexities of having to both use imperfect tools, but know those tools are participating potentially in harm. That feels very, very striking.
I was going to say then, I don't know, I don't want to take us in a completely different direction, but I am, as Jules was talking about this kind of controlled way of using your senses, and the surgeon struck me as well. I immediately thought of Nikki Sullivan's The Somotechnics of Perception in the Matter of the Non-Human, a critical response to the new materialism, which I know you reference in your work, Marie. And when Nikki is writing about an illusionist or magician and people who experience this dinner theater magic show, illusion show, and then leave the restaurant and feel like he hypnotized them or did something because their senses are just working in a maybe hyper drive way. The sky is bluer, or things taste more strong than normal, and how illusion ties into, certainly directly into what Jules is exploring in their project. And I just have to give a shout out to the Hay Library at Brown. Has a large collection of magic and occult books, and the librarian and curators are working on a project around this, and one of them went to a conference on magic and illusion, and it was half magicians and illusionists and half neuroscientists and researchers who are interested in exactly what Jules is exploring in their project. And maybe I took this off into just in a direction, but I think that there's a way to bring this into Jules's essay on transcensing modalities, right? And you have so many wonderful articulations of your work through that essay. The one that I highlighted in my notes is that it's the methods that trans people, specifically those who identify as transgender, but also people whose subjectivity is unmoored from dominant culture, intuitively cultivate to navigate the world. So it's this hypersensitivity or attuning a different type of frequency, right? And you also talk about that there are more empathetic responses to audio space than necessarily visual space. And I'm thinking a lot about this in Zoom, even as we navigate right now without being in the same room together, when one of us is going to speak, or like, I'm trying to not talk too much between you two, because you're who I want to hear, not myself. But I think that essay, like, again, is just so amplified in our current state of interconnectedness exclusively through this camera, where you can't register body language. And I think there's a lot of misinterpretation happening across Zoom right now, particularly around collaboration. I'm finding it's difficult to collaborate because you just can't read people. But maybe Jules's essay is pushing me to think that maybe all of our calls should be auditory calls and not visually based. I know there's a lot to unpack from what I just said, but I thought, Jules, maybe you would talk a little bit about that artist op-ed that you wrote for the Walker Art Center.
Yeah, I mean, when I heard about this idea of deep fakes, or started seeing them, and everyone was having this, or most people in the media were talking about, like, oh my God, we're going to not know what is real because the videos are going to look too real, and then we're going to be confused. I just kind of thinking, well, when did we start to think that what we saw on the media was real? And I also thought, oh, that's like how trans people are. We are like kind of in this deep fake experience all the time of like discerning and assessing what we are or what we are not, and this constant like toggling and evaluation. And is, in this moment, or not moment, years of being like fake news, and, we have to, we're skewed now to this other side of like, we can only believe in facts. Like facts are going to set us free. And it's like, no, that's never been the truth. Like, ironically, I would say that, that we can't now skew to only empirical data and science is the only thing that's going to help us get out of, because people have been lying to us and it's all, but, yes, that is true. But if we kind of think that the only way forward is through facts, then like we make ourselves very vulnerable to whatever anyone wants to say is a fact. Or, I just think that we have to, if we can't, if things like deepfakes are going to occur, which they are, we have to, change the way that we are understanding our own perceptive systems and being able to discern things and understand where the information comes from in more complex ways. And I was making that relationship to the idea, making a relationship to transcensing as just something that you have to cultivate as a trans person, or I would say any body that is kind of existing outside of dominant white heteronormativity. Like you have to attune to these contingent relationships constantly, or what Marie's talking about in terms of the apparatus through which data, you have to understand the apparatus. You don't have a choice, because you don't exist if you can't understand the apparatus. And I think that's what I was talking about in terms of transcensing. It's just like you intuitively kind of cultivate this nuanced way of perceiving it that isn't just based on, oh, I'm seeing a video, all of a sudden I think that, well, yeah. So that's what I was talking about there in terms of a transcensing that we can all kind of, I think, cultivate more nuance, and we can talk about this in terms of visual dominance too. Like we live in a visually dominant culture, and so a lot of what we name, believe, identify comes from language and visual, empirical kind of ways of categorizing that makes things real. And we can talk about that in terms of gender. But then what happens if we do prioritize the sonic or the auditory? Then we get into these slippery spaces that we're talking about. And that's when we get into these confusing spaces. And that's why Marie gets, can write all these different books, because and that's why I can keep on iterating my works over and over again, because it's the same thing over again, but I kind of do it through all these different ways. And because it's endless, as opposed to being like, that is a X or that is a Y, and that, we can point to that with the visual and with, I think, language as well.
Yeah, that's really interesting to talk about the relationship between the auditory and the visual. I mean, Kate, just to go back to your point about it only being auditory calls, I feel like I have to rep the Tinnitus project a bit here. There are lots of reasons why purely auditory calls, why for some people would not be ideal. But the fact, so this is where I always really struggle of, on the one hand, I do think there is something specific to the auditory, and that specificity is socially and culturally informed, but there is something specific to the auditory, I think, and part of that, I think, is, Jules, what you're referring to, this slipperiness, I guess, that we're both invoking here, is significant, and I guess the permeability that comes with that as well. So on the one hand, yes, I totally get why the auditory might be envisaged as a space through which alternative modes of relation can be formulated. And I think that's partly what, when we talk about wanting to kind of switch off the camera, that's kind of what we're talking about, right? The idea that through this mode of sensory encounter, we can formulate different modes of relation. And I think this points to something that I find really fascinating about the auditory. And I don't think it's exclusive to it, but I think it's something that becomes quite prevalent in lots of writing and practices about sound. And that's the fact that you have both a tendency, there's a utopian tendency in sound, but it also is a very useful marker for our actually existing relations. And that I find it quite difficult sometimes to hang on to that utopian potential. And part of that's because I don't think sound can do anything alone. I think it's about the things that sound can bring to it otherwise, and that's why I'm talking about relations and social relations as being key here as well. But there is something, there is this kind of multi-directional quality to the sonic and to the auditory. And I think when we start talking about visual dominance and the possibilities of the auditory to do things otherwise, I think it's really important to hang on to that. At the same time, it's really important to hang on to the fact that the auditory, in the same way as the visual, is not one mode of perception and one thing. Neither is the auditory, and how that manifests. And Jules, I think this is something that your work is really powerful in drawing attention to. There are different auditory sensory modes, and we need to hang on to that. And it goes as far as saying for some people, the auditory mode of relating might be formulated in very different ways, or it might not be preferable, or it might be harmful even. So yeah, these are the kinds of complexities you have to hang on to when thinking about and writing with sound. And I don't think it's different to the visual in that sense, but it feels like we don't quite have the language for some of this as well, which makes it tricky.
Yeah, it's that slippage that we keep talking about, that like certain words kind of morph into the way that, you know, across the three of our usages. But I really like that morphology that happens. And maybe, Marie, it might drive you crazy as an academic who maybe likes, you know, fixed terms in conversations. Certainly this is quite normal in the way that I always communicate with artists and talk about their projects. It's like it's an evolution of terminology, and that's, I suppose that's why I'm always interested in injecting these conversations into more scientifically oriented symposiums. Love Data Week, for example, at Brown, to see where that leaking occurs, right? To see what is stable and what isn't within conversations happening in other fields. I always think that artists like Jules are always thinking farther and deeper and more creatively than curators and art historians about a lot of these issues. I wonder if we can circle back, since I know we're at the 45-minute mark, and I want to talk a little bit more about Jules's actual artistic practice and maybe how the conversation as it's flowed so far again comes back into your work, and particularly the project at Brown. And I know that I never want to push artists to share what they're not ready to share, but maybe you can let us know like some of the research or the materials. I don't know if I should mention algae at all, and how that might be deployed in the project this fall at Cohen, though I hope Facilities is not watching right now. We have to get approval.
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly what is going to all kind of come to be, but I have been, working. I feel like a little hesitant to say anything because it might change, but yeah, I mean, I just think that all of this research around illusion and quantification and systems of naming and identifying in relation to like queer strategies or trans strategies to like shake off or like kind of work through those systems is something that's like what is going to be happening. And then the specifics, I mean, it has been kind of, in my files and stuff, I'm kind of calling it rock time right now, which gives it another thing, but like this idea of compressed, of a different time scale. So thinking about measurement and systems of measurement, and rocks as holding this kind of time scale that humans don't perceive and understand. We're existing in our own scale of time. And so I've been kind of calling it rock time right now, thinking also about time as this metronome or pulse of keeping time, that is like this external system. So playing, all I can say is I'm gonna be playing with different materials that maybe have different times and scales within them, and then thinking about measurement and systems and the body and identification and pushing outside of those systems. And that's all I can say. And algae might be part of it, because algae and other kind of microscopic organisms that have this other kind of sense of time as well, and and this idea of the indicator species, which is the piece I just put out a piece in Klaus Gallery in a 3-person show called Trans as Indicator Species, and I was thinking about that trans bodies as this permeable membrane, our skin, this like the way we take in hormones and other materials. And then I collected the sweat of trans friends and people I know, and then it's being evaporated into the gallery. It's a piece, it's a sculptural piece, but I'm thinking about an indicator species also as kind of pointing to a different, something is changing, something is happening, and I don't know. This might be it's pretty jumbled at this point, but that's all I got right now. It all comes together in the fall.
And again, this is one of those examples of things circling through. The only reason that I read the Nikki Sullivan essay is because of your article, Marie, and I noted Nikki's phrase, queer and anthropomorphized materials. And of course, I instantly thought about the way Jules is thinking about algae. So I forget if we said this in the recorded conversation or right before we started recording, but this is more of a rhizomatic conversation around both of your practices. And it's impossible to be linear. And I wonder how that relates to Jules's project and how it will unfold in the fall, this idea of linearity in terms of a discussion, or in terms of central terminology that everyone shares. And I actually again, slippages, liquidity, the ways that there's a looseness and a resistance against reification as we talk about this.
And I could just say one more thing, in order to keep that fresh fluidity or something, we can talk, the fresh fluids of my work happening, it has to happen in the moment, right? That also is what has to happen. So, I can plan, I can do, create I can create all the I can plan for all the circumstances around the work, but then when it's all coming together and then I will be able to really kind of see what we're actually working with, and how, with sound, because I use transducers a lot of my work. So it's like actually pushing the sound through the objects, and then the objects are resonating in the space, and then the space is causing an reverb. And so there's like all these tunings that constantly have to be happening. And that's not just with the sonic, but it is, and also with the visual and all these contingent relationships. And so for me, my process is usually that I write something pretty involved, like a thing. And that from there, then I'll be able to, the particulars of that will start to appear. And then like in this last piece I just did, it was about the copper skin and then the microscopic video and the sound of the pulse emanating through the copper and the mirroring that's happening when you look at it, and the distortion, and all those things on their own that doesn't amount to much. But then when you add them together into this compositional whole is when these set of relationships start to become more interesting and apparent and dynamic. And so there's just a way in which that's just, that's just.
I wonder, one thing that I'm interested in, having arrived at Brown about a year and a half ago, is the return in terms of a conversation or a relationship with an artist, or in your case, Marie, maybe we should revisit this conversation in the fall once Jules has written that document. Perhaps you'll have published more that we can absorb and talk about, and there will actually be a physical manifestation of Jules's work in the Cohen Gallery, which should open hopefully in October, if the pandemic can be at a point where we can open the galleries at that time, because I think this conversation begs that return and begs us to revisit, and maybe our use of terminology won't be as slippery as it is now, though I always enjoy that aspect of kind of studio visit pre-production conversations.
Yeah, that would be great.
I think that's a nice way to end, is to kind of gesture towards another future conversation with the three of us, and maybe another guest or two can join.
That would be great.
Thank you both.